I stood still for a long time by the window, watching raindrops slide slowly down the glass. The city in the late afternoon was blurred and hazy, just like my emotions right now, tangled, heavy, impossible to name. Some pain doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people you trust the most. And when that happens, your heart doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks quietly, little by little. That car, I bought it with years of relentless hard work, sleepless nights, rushed meals, and countless times I wiped away my tears just to keep going. It wasn't just an $80,000 car. It was proof of my growth, my independence, my quiet pride. And yet, in a single moment, it was taken from me so effortlessly. I found out through a brief, casual phone call. Mom and Dad let your sibling borrow the car. No asking, no warning, not even an explanation. The voice on the other end was calm to the point of coldness, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if all the years I sacrificed meant nothing. I sank down into my chair, my hands trembling. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. It wasn't about losing the car. It was about feeling dismissed, overlooked, pushed aside, simply because I was always the one who knew how to endure. For years, I taught myself to understand, to give in, to stay silent for the sake of family peace. I told myself that sacrificing a little was fine, as long as everyone stayed harmonious. But this time, that silence turned into a sharp blade, cutting straight into my self-respect. I realized that some boundaries, if you don't protect them yourself, no one else will. And sometimes, standing up isn't about revenge, it's about saving yourself from being hurt again. In that moment, I knew. If I didn't change, I would always be the one left behind. I didn't cry. At least, not right then. Some pain is so overwhelming that tears feel meaningless. Instead, it sinks inward, settling into a heavy weight in your chest, making every breath harder than the last. I picked up my phone and opened the tracking app. The small blue dot blinked on the screen, moving inch by inch, almost as if it were mocking me. The car, the result of years of my life, was drifting farther away, meter by meter, street by street, intersection by intersection. And with every bit of distance it gained, my chest tightened just a little more. I called my mom. No answer. I called my dad. Just the endless ringing on the other end. That silence hurt more than any harsh words could have. It told me they had made their choice, and I wasn't part of it. I remembered all the times I comforted myself, saying that family is the place you return to, the one place where you don't have to be on guard. But now, that very place had become the first battlefield, where I was forced to protect myself. If you understand this feeling, comment 1. I sat alone in the quiet room, listening to the cold, steady ticking of the clock. Each passing second wore down another layer of hesitation. Somewhere between forgiveness and finally standing up for myself, I realized something. If I kept enduring in silence, I would slowly lose who I was. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the number. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the result of being pushed to the very edge. I took a deep breath, my voice strangely calm as I reported that my car was being used without my permission. After I hung up, I sat there motionless for a long time. In that moment, I was no longer the obedient child who always gave in. I was simply a person trying to protect the last fragile boundary of my self-respect. And I knew that from that second on, nothing would ever be the same again. I stayed in the dark, eyes fixed on my phone screen. The blinking blue dot suddenly slowed, then stopped in the middle of a highway. My heart pounded so hard my ears rang. I knew the moment had finally arrived. A short message appeared. We've stopped the vehicle. I closed my eyes briefly. In my mind, I saw my younger brother standing by the roadside, his face confused and panicked, red and blue lights flashing against the night behind him. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. Just a cold emptiness spreading slowly through my chest. The next call came almost immediately. My mother's voice was trembling, rushed, laced with anger. Why would you do this? He's your brother. I went silent not because of the accusation, but because of how painfully familiar it felt. In every critical moment, I was always the one expected to understand, to give in, to sacrifice. I took a slow breath and said calmly that the car was legally mine. I had never given permission, and I had only done what was necessary to protect my property. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the line went dead. After the police finished verifying the paperwork, the truth was undeniable. The car was returned to me untouched, cold. I placed my hand on the steering wheel. The familiar feeling now felt strangely distant, as if I were touching a piece of memory that had just been torn apart. No one in my family said another word. No apology. No explanation. Just an invisible wall rising between us, thick and cold. If you need an online hug, comment 1. That night, I drove slowly, letting the city drift past on both sides like a silent film. I realized then that some wounds don't need noise to cut deep. They quietly change the way you see the people who once meant everything to you. I got the car back. But what I truly lost was the feeling of belonging. After that night, I stopped being the one to reach out to my family. Not out of anger, but because I needed space to understand myself. Some wounds, if you keep touching them, will never stop bleeding. I chose to let go, not to hold on to resentment, but not to keep sacrificing myself either. The next morning, I drove out to the outskirts of the city and stopped by an empty field. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the pale sunlight spread across the windshield, and for the first time in days, I exhaled without feeling tightness in my chest. I thought about the years that had passed, the countless times I tried to please everyone, the moments I swallowed my tears to keep peace in a home that was already full of cracks. I used to believe that if I was patient enough, forgiving enough, everything would eventually be okay. But now I understand. Prolonged silence only feeds quiet, growing pain. No one ever taught me how to set boundaries. I had to learn it through my own wounds. I paid for it with loss, with sadness, and with the loneliness of feeling alone even among my own family. But in that very moment, I realized I was growing up. I was no longer the child waiting for approval, no longer the person willing to trade pieces of myself for the sake of family. I began learning how to love myself first. The car rolled slowly down the long road. Ahead of me, the sky opened wide, clear, vast, and strangely peaceful. I knew this path might be lonely, but it was one I chose for myself, a road without fear, without bowing my head. Some losses can never be replaced, but sometimes they are the beginning of a different kind of life, stronger, freer, and more honest with yourself. Time passed slowly, as if deliberately stretching the silence between us. In that quiet, I started hearing things I used to avoid. The soft sigh in my mother's brief phone calls, the heaviness in my father's voice whenever my name came up, and the awkward hesitation in my brother's tone when we happened to cross paths. My family began to realize that the real loss wasn't the car, it was the bond between us, pulled so tight it was close to snapping. But that realization came too late. Some wounds, once they freeze over in the heart, are almost impossible to fully thaw, no matter how much regret follows. My mother called me on a rainy evening, her voice trembled softly, no blame, no firmness left. Just a quiet question. Have you been okay lately? I stayed silent for a long time before answering. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know how to put into words everything I had been through. On the other end of the line, I heard a faint, choked sob. I understood then maybe my mother was also learning to face the things she had once taken for granted. But between understanding and forgiveness, there is still a long distance. I no longer hold resentment. I no longer wait for a complete apology either. I only hope they come to understand that family cannot be built on favoritism and one-sided sacrifice. That love, without respect, will eventually become a burden. If you're learning to let go, comment 1. That night, I looked out at the rain, feeling an unfamiliar sense of calm. Maybe we were all learning a lesson too late, that holding on to each other shouldn't be about control, but about understanding and boundaries. I began building a new rhythm of life, slower and quieter. Instead of trying to fill every empty space with busyness, I learned to simply be with myself. Each morning, I made a cup of hot tea, opened the window, and let the breeze drift into my small room. In those simple moments, I realized that peace is sometimes nothing more than breathing deeply without having to brace yourself. I placed a few more potted plants on the balcony. Every day, I watered them and watched the tiny shoots push their way up in silence. In that patience, I saw that I, too, was growing quietly and steadily. The scars didn't disappear, but they no longer throbbed with pain. Instead, they reminded me that I had been hurt and that I had found the strength to stand back up on my own. I didn't cut my family off. I simply learned to keep a safe enough distance so I wouldn't keep hurting myself. We talk less now, and more slowly, but more honestly. No more blame. No more expectations. Just a cautious understanding, fragile but necessary. Some afternoons, I drive down a long stretch of road, letting the sunset paint the sky in gold. I smile, realizing I'm no longer afraid of being alone. Because when a person learns how to love and respect themselves, they no longer feel lost even when they're on their own. My story doesn't end in victory or compromise. It ends in awakening. Sometimes, you have to go through loss to truly understand what is worth holding on to for the rest of your life. And for me, that is myself. One morning, I woke up feeling different. No heaviness, no exhaustion. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested softly on my pillow, warm in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I lay there for a few quiet minutes, listening to my heartbeat, and realized it had been a long time since I last felt truly at peace. I began reorganizing my life, starting with the smallest things. I cleaned my room, letting go of old belongings, items that carried too many heavy memories. With each thing I released, my heart felt a little lighter, as if I were slowly freeing myself from the past. I returned to work with a new mindset. I no longer worked just to prove my worth, no longer threw myself into the grind until I was exhausted. I worked because I wanted to, because I valued my own effort. And strangely enough, once I stopped forcing myself so hard, I started going further. Some evenings, I drive alone through familiar streets. The city lights glow. The crowds move in a rush, and I drift quietly within that flow, not hurried, not waiting for anything. I've come to understand that I'm no longer searching for anyone's approval. I just need to know that I'm living in alignment with myself. I've learned to listen to my emotions, to accept moments of weakness, and to allow myself to rest. I've stopped blaming myself for once believing, for once sacrificing, for once getting hurt, because without those cracks, I wouldn't have become the steadier version of who I am today. Maybe growing up isn't about appearing stronger in other people's eyes, it's about learning to be gentler with yourself. And when I look back at the road I've traveled, I no longer feel resentment, only gratitude, because that pain taught me how to stand tall, walk slowly, and live without regret. I stood in front of the familiar door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. This house had once been the place I returned to after every stumble, my childhood refuge. And yet now, it felt as distant as if I were standing before an entirely different world. The door opened. My mother stood there, thinner than before. Her eyes met mine, softened for a brief second, then quickly looked away. No one hugged me. No one blamed me either. Just a quiet silence filling the space heavier than any words. I sat down on the old chair in the living room. Everything seemed the same, and yet I knew something had changed forever. The ticking of the wall clock echoed steadily, each beat landing straight against my heart. I looked at my father. His head was lowered, his hands tightly clasped together. I looked at my mother. She kept twisting the handkerchief in her hands, her shoulders trembling slightly. My younger brother sat quietly in the corner, not daring to look up. In that moment, I suddenly no longer saw them as the people who had hurt me, but simply as flawed human beings, lost in their own way of loving. I wanted to say so much. I wanted to ask why I was always the one who had to give in. I wanted to shout that I feel pain too. But in the end, all of it dissolved into a long, quiet breath. Softly, I said, "I just want to be respected." No one responded. But I heard a faint, choked sob. I don't know who it came from. The meeting ended in silence. As I stepped outside, I turned back to look at the house one more time. No more resentment, but not quite full forgiveness either. Just a deep emptiness where memory and the present quietly met. And I understood. Some reunions aren't meant to mend things, but to close an old chapter of your life. I didn't expect that call to come late one evening, when the city lights were glowing and the noise of the day had finally faded. My father's number appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, hesitating between answering or letting it pass like so many times before. In the end, I picked up. On the other end of the line, his voice was hoarse and slow, as if every word had been carefully weighed. He didn't beat around the bush. He simply said, "I'm sorry." Those two words fell softly, yet they carried a weight that made it hard to breathe. I gently closed my eyes. Old memories rushed back, the times I stayed silent and endured, the times I convinced myself that adults were always right, that family shouldn't be measured or questioned. "We should have protected you," he continued, his voice breaking, "but we got used to letting you be the one who sacrificed." I didn't know whether to cry or to laugh. The apology came after the wound had already scarred over, no longer bleeding, but still aching beneath the surface. It couldn't erase the hurt, but it couldn't be dismissed either. I stayed quiet for a long time. In that moment, I felt myself standing between two shores. On one side, the child who once longed for recognition. On the other, the adult who had learned to stand on her own. And I understood that I no longer needed an apology to keep moving forward. I spoke slowly, saying that I was okay now, and that I hoped our family would learn to love one another more fairly. No accusations, no blame, just a boundary, gentle but clear. The call ended in silence. I set my phone down and looked out into the dark window. Inside me, there were no more storms, only a deep stillness. Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about choosing not to let old pain keep guiding your present. Night fell slowly. The city sank into faint halos of light, and I sat quietly by the window, listening to the wind brush softly against the curtains. Everything seemed to have settled, yet inside me, a vague emptiness still lingered. Some stories don't have perfect endings. They don't close with joyful reunions, nor do they end in bitterness. They simply pause at a fragile line between forgiveness and acceptance. I no longer blame my family, but I can't return to how things used to be. What's been broken, even if carefully pieced back together, still shows fine cracks. And those cracks remind me of how deeply I once hurt. I've learned to keep moving forward, carrying the memories as part of my luggage, not heavy, not denied. I know I'll see them again. There will be cautious conversations, quiet family meals, forced smiles. But within that caution, I'm learning how to love without hurting myself in the process. Outside, a car sped past, leaving behind a brief streak of light in the dark. I suddenly thought that a human life is much like those streaks appearing, flaring brightly, then fading into the night. What remains isn't what we own, but what we've learned after each loss. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow will still come, carrying the unknown with it, and I will step into it without fear, without waiting, simply living quietly, slowly, and fully in my own way. Maybe that's how I choose to close this chapter, and how I begin again. Some mornings, I wake up and realize I've stopped waiting. I no longer hope for explanations, no longer expect anyone to make up for old wounds. I just quietly brew my tea, open the window, and let the sunlight spill across my hands. Life goes on calm and steady. I go to work, return home, water the plants, cook simple meals. Small things, but enough to keep me grounded in the present. And in those ordinary moments, I come to understand something. Happiness isn't about being loved the right way. It's about learning to love yourself in a healthy, balanced way. My family is still there, just a little farther away, a little quieter. We're no longer too close, but we haven't turned our backs on each other either. Between us is a silence wide enough to keep from hurting one another again. I carry the old memories with me, not to let them hold me back, but to remind myself how strong I once had to be. And when I look back now, I no longer see loss. I see a long road that helped me grow. Maybe, after everything, the most precious thing I managed to keep was myself.